A king knelt in a stream the night before battle, praying to a god he wasn't sure was listening anymore. Robert the Bruce had spent 8 years running, hiding, watching his brothers executed, his wife imprisoned, his people slaughtered. Now, on June 23, 1314, he faced the largest English army ever assembled to invade Scotland. 20,000 men, 2,500 heavy cavalry, the same military machine that had conquered Wales and terrified France. Bruce had perhaps 7,000 troops, mostly infantry with spears, no heavy cavalry, and a tactical problem that had destroyed every Scottish army for the past 18 years. English knights in full armor were considered invincible. Infantry armed with spears were supposed to die when knights charged. Tomorrow, Bruce would either prove that assumption wrong or watch Scotland disappear as an independent nation. He had one advantage the English didn't know about. He had spent 8 years thinking about nothing except how to kill armored knights with farmers holding sticks. England's King Edward II was everything his father was not. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had been a military genius who nearly destroyed Scotland through relentless campaigns and strategic brutality. His son Edward II was weak, indecisive, dominated by favorites, and possessed military judgment so catastrophically poor that historians still debate whether incompetence or arrogance was his primary flaw. When he inherited the throne in 1307, he also inherited a war in Scotland that his father had almost won. Edward II would spend the next 7 years losing everything his father had gained, culminating in a battle where his overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and resources would be transformed into the most humiliating defeat in English medieval history. The war had been going badly for England since 1307. Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306 after murdering his rival John Comyn in a church, had transformed from fugitive to victor through a combination of guerrilla warfare, castle sieges, and careful avoidance of pitched battles. Bruce understood Scottish weakness perfectly. His infantry could not survive against English heavy cavalry in open field combat, so he refused to fight that kind of battle. Instead, he captured castles through siege and surprise, raided northern England, and rebuilt Scottish resistance one small victory at a time. By 1314, only a handful of castles remained in English hands. The most important was Stirling Castle, the strategic key to central Scotland. Stirling Castle sat on a massive volcanic rock overlooking the River Forth. Whoever controlled Stirling controlled access between the Scottish Highlands and Lowlands. The English garrison, commanded by Sir Philip Mowbray, had been under siege by Bruce's brother Edward for months. Mowbray negotiated a peculiar agreement. If the English did not relieve the castle by midsummer 1314, he would surrender it. This put enormous pressure on King Edward II. If he allowed Stirling to fall without attempting relief, he would look weak and incompetent. If he marched north with an army and was defeated, the consequences would be catastrophic. Edward chose to march, but he made every possible mistake in how he did it. Edward assembled the largest English army since his father's campaigns. Modern estimates suggest around 15,000 to 20,000 men, including at least 2,000 to 2,500 heavy cavalry. These were not ceremonial knights, but professional soldiers in full plate armor riding massive war horses bred for combat. Each knight represented years of training and enormous expense. They were the medieval equivalent of tanks, designed to smash through infantry formations through sheer mass and momentum. Supporting them were thousands of infantry, archers with the devastating English longbow, and extensive supply trains. It was a military machine that should have been unstoppable. The army marched north in June 1314, moving slowly due to its size and logistical requirements. Edward gave little thought to tactics or terrain. His plan, to the extent he had one, was to reach Stirling, force Bruce to fight or retreat, and restore English control through overwhelming force. He did not scout the terrain carefully. He did not secure his flanks. He did not consider what Bruce might do if offered battle on ground of Bruce's choosing. These oversights would prove fatal. Robert the Bruce had been preparing for this moment since becoming king. He positioned his army south of Stirling, near a small stream called Bannockburn, on terrain he had selected specifically for its advantages. To the English approaching from the south, the ground looked open enough for cavalry maneuvers. What they didn't immediately see were the marshes, the small streams, the soft ground that would bog down horses, and most importantly, the hundreds of concealed pits Bruce's men had dug across the likely English approach routes. These pits, about a foot wide and a foot deep, were covered with brush and designed to break horses' legs when cavalry charged. Bruce had also positioned his forces near a forest called New Park, giving his troops a clear line of retreat if the battle went badly. He had thought through every contingency because he had learned through bitter experience that English military superiority was real and could only be beaten through perfect preparation. On June 23rd, the vanguard of the English army encountered Scottish forces near the Bannockburn. What happened next became legend. Henry de Bohun, an English knight, spotted Robert the Bruce inspecting his troops. Bruce was mounted on a small palfrey, not a warhorse, carrying only a battle axe. De Bohun saw an opportunity for instant glory. Kill the Scottish king in single combat before the battle even began. He lowered his lance and charged. Bruce, rather than fleeing or calling for help, turned his smaller horse to face the oncoming knight. At the last possible moment, Bruce swerved aside, rose in his stirrups, and brought his axe down on de Bohun's helmet with such force that the axe shaft shattered. De Bohun fell dead from his horse, his skull split open. The Scottish troops erupted in cheers. Bruce's only comment, according to witnesses, was annoyance that he had broken his favorite axe. The psychological impact of this moment cannot be overstated. The Scottish troops saw their king personally kill an English knight in single combat, confirming Bruce's courage and divine favor. The English saw their cavalry charge, supposedly invincible, defeated by one man with an axe. It was an omen, though Edward II was too arrogant to recognize it. The same afternoon saw another engagement when a larger English cavalry force attempted to reach Stirling Castle by circling the Scottish position. They ran into a Scottish schiltron commanded by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray. A schiltron was a defensive formation of spearmen arranged in a tight circle or square, spears pointing outward like a hedgehog. English knights charged repeatedly, but could not break the formation. Horses will not willingly impale themselves on spears, and once the charge stalled, the tightly packed knights became targets for the Scottish spears. The English eventually withdrew, having accomplished nothing except demonstrating that Scottish infantry could stand against cavalry charges if properly led and positioned. Edward II now faced a decision. He had already lost 2 preliminary engagements. His army was tired from the march and demoralized by the skirmishes. The ground ahead was difficult terrain, increasingly marshy as it approached the Bannockburn. Night was falling. The sensible decision would have been to withdraw, rest his troops, and choose better ground for battle. Instead, Edward ordered his army to camp in the low ground between the Bannockburn and the River Forth. This was a catastrophic error. His troops spent an uncomfortable night in cramped conditions on boggy ground with the stream behind them and the Scottish army on higher ground ahead. They had no room to maneuver, no clear line of retreat, and no tactical advantage whatsoever. Bruce held a council of war that night. Some of his commanders urged retreat, arguing that they had achieved enough by repelling the English probes. Bruce disagreed. He recognized that Edward had made terrible tactical mistakes, and that the English army was now in the worst possible position. If the Scots attacked at dawn, they could catch the English disorganized, on bad ground with limited ability to deploy their cavalry effectively. It was a risk, but it was also an opportunity that might never come again. Bruce decided to attack. Dawn on June 24th, 1314, broke over the most important battle in Scottish history. The Scottish army advanced in 4 schiltrons, massive blocks of spearmen, thousands strong, moving forward in disciplined formation. Bruce commanded the reserve. His brother Edward led 1 schiltron, Thomas Randolph another, and James Douglas the third. The formations advanced slowly, spears leveled, presenting an unbroken hedge of steel points to the English army, still struggling to organize itself on the marshy ground. The English attempted to deploy their cavalry for the charge that was supposed to shatter the Scottish formations, but the ground was terrible for horses. The marshland sucked at hooves. The hidden pits Bruce had prepared broke horses' legs. The Scottish schiltrons kept advancing, pushing the English cavalry back into their own infantry. The English could not form proper lines. Knights found themselves crushed together, unable to build the momentum needed for an effective charge. Those who did charge found that horses would not push into the hedge of spears, and once the charge stopped, the riders became vulnerable to Scottish spearmen who pulled them from their saddles or struck at their unarmored horses. The English longbowmen, who could have devastated the Scottish formations, were positioned badly and could not shoot effectively without hitting their own knights. When they did loose volleys, they inflicted some casualties, but nothing decisive. Bruce had kept a small force of light cavalry in reserve specifically to deal with archers. He sent them forward, and they scattered the English archers before they could do serious damage. This eliminated England's most effective ranged weapon at a critical moment. The battle became a grinding slaughter as the Scottish schiltrons pushed forward. The English army, compressed into an increasingly small space between the advancing Scots and the Bannockburn behind them, lost all cohesion. Knights in full armor found themselves being pulled from their horses and stabbed to death on the ground. Infantry tried to retreat but had nowhere to go. The Bannockburn, a small stream in normal circumstances, became a death trap as hundreds of men tried to cross it simultaneously while being pursued by Scottish spearmen. Edward II, watching his army disintegrate, finally attempted to rally his troops personally. But medieval command and control was limited, and once formations broke, there was no way to restore order in the chaos of close combat. English nobles began fleeing the field, trying to reach the safety of Stirling Castle or escape south. Edward's bodyguard, recognizing that the king was in mortal danger, forced him to leave the battlefield. They fled toward Stirling Castle, only to have Sir Philip Mowbray, the castle's commander, tell them that the castle could not shelter the king because it was about to surrender. Edward and his bodyguard turned and rode south, pursued by Scottish cavalry under James Douglas. They barely escaped, reaching Dunbar Castle after a harrowing chase. The English army, abandoned by its king and its nobles, collapsed completely. Those who could flee did so. Those who couldn't were killed or captured. The Bannockburn became clogged with bodies and drowning men in armor. The retreat turned into a massacre as Scottish forces pursued the fleeing English for miles. By the end of the day, the English had lost perhaps 4,000 to 11,000 men, including hundreds of knights and nobles. The Scottish casualties were probably under 1,000. More importantly, the English lost their aura of invincibility. The military machine that had crushed Wales and threatened France had been destroyed by Scottish infantry armed with spears. The immediate consequences of Bannockburn were enormous. Stirling Castle surrendered as agreed. Every remaining English-held castle in Scotland fell within months. Robert the Bruce's position as King of Scots, previously shaky and contested, became unassailable. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had been fence-sitting between English and Scottish allegiance, now firmly supported Bruce. Edward II's authority in England collapsed. He faced rebellions, opposition from his barons, and eventual deposition and murder in 1327. The defeat at Bannockburn destroyed his credibility and ensured he would never recover political control. The strategic impact extended far beyond Scotland. England's capacity to wage offensive war in Scotland was crippled for years. Bruce, emboldened by victory, launched devastating raids into northern England, burning towns and extracting tribute to avoid further destruction. The English counties near the Scottish border were systematically devastated, their populations living in terror of Scottish raids. Edward II could not stop these raids because he lacked the military force and the political support to mount another major campaign. The diplomatic consequences rippled across Europe. The papacy, which had supported English claims to Scotland, was forced to reconsider. France, watching England's humiliation with interest, saw opportunities to challenge English holdings in Aquitaine. The balance of power in the British Isles shifted permanently. Scotland would remain independent for another 3 centuries, until the Union of Crowns in 1603 and the eventual Acts of Union in 1707. But even then, Scotland negotiated union as a partner, not as a conquered province. Bannockburn ensured that Scotland could never be absorbed by military conquest. The military lessons of Bannockburn were studied for centuries. Bruce had demonstrated that infantry, properly led and positioned, could defeat cavalry even when outnumbered. His use of terrain, his preparation of the battlefield with concealed obstacles, his timing of the attack when the enemy was disorganized, and his combined arms approach using cavalry to neutralize English archers, all became textbook examples of how to defeat a numerically superior force. Swiss pikemen in the 14th and 15th centuries would use similar tactics to defeat mounted knights. The lesson was clear. Technological superiority means nothing if you let your enemy choose the battlefield and the timing of engagement. The psychological dimension of Bannockburn extended beyond military tactics. Bruce had unified Scotland through victory in a way that years of guerrilla warfare never could. Scots, who had been divided by clan loyalties, regional interests, and doubts about Bruce's legitimacy, now rallied to a proven winner. The myth of Robert the Bruce as the great liberator king was born at Bannockburn and has endured for 7 centuries. Modern Scottish nationalism still references the battle as proof that Scotland can stand against larger neighbors and prevail through courage, skill, and leadership. The English perspective on Bannockburn was one of humiliation and incomprehension. How could the greatest military power in Britain be destroyed by Scottish infantry? The official explanations blamed Edward II's incompetence, which was certainly a factor, but this avoided confronting the deeper truth. English military doctrine was flawed. The reliance on heavy cavalry charges against prepared infantry positions was becoming obsolete, but English commanders refused to adapt. They would make similar mistakes at Crécy in 1346 and Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen would slaughter French cavalry using the same tactics Bruce had used against them. The personal stories from Bannockburn reveal the human cost beneath the strategic analysis. The Earl of Gloucester, one of England's premier nobles, died leading a charge against the Scottish lines. His body was recovered and returned to England with honors, but his death represented the destruction of one of England's great families. Hundreds of English knights were captured and held for ransom, bankrupting their families and enriching the Scottish crown. Common soldiers, both English and Scottish, died anonymously in the mud and water of the Bannockburn, their deaths recorded only as numbers in chronicles written by men who never saw combat. Robert the Bruce's actions after Bannockburn reveal his strategic sophistication. He did not attempt to invade and conquer England, which would have been logistically impossible and strategically foolish. Instead, he focused on securing Scottish independence through a combination of military raids, diplomatic initiatives, and political consolidation. He sought recognition from the papacy, negotiated with France and other European powers, and worked to ensure that his succession would be secure. His ultimate goal was not military glory, but political survival for Scotland as an independent kingdom. The Declaration of Arbroath, issued in 1320, represents the culmination of the process Bannockburn began. This document, sent to Pope John, asserted Scottish independence in terms that would echo through history. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. The declaration's rhetoric was powerful, but it had teeth only because Bannockburn had proven that Scotland could defend that independence militarily. Edward II never recovered from Bannockburn. His remaining years were marked by political chaos, rebellion, and eventual deposition by his wife Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer. He was imprisoned and murdered in 1327 in circumstances so brutal that chroniclers could barely bring themselves to describe them. His failure at Bannockburn was not the sole cause of his downfall, but it was the moment when his incompetence became undeniable. A medieval king who could not win wars lost legitimacy, and Edward had lost the most important war of his reign in the most humiliating manner possible. The site of the Battle of Bannockburn is preserved today as a national monument. Visitors can walk the ground where the Chilterns advanced, see the marshy terrain that trapped the English cavalry, and visit the memorial to Robert the Bruce. The exact location of the main fighting is debated by historians, as medieval battlefield descriptions are imprecise and the terrain has changed over 7 centuries. But the general area is undisputed, and standing there, you can understand why Bruce chose this ground. The advantages are subtle but real. The high ground, the marshes channeling enemy movement, the stream behind creating psychological pressure on attackers who know they have limited room to retreat. Modern Scottish identity is inextricably linked to Bannockburn. The battle is commemorated in songs, poems, literature, and political rhetoric. When Scotland voted on independence in 2014, 700 years after the battle, both sides referenced Bannockburn in their arguments. For independence supporters, it was proof that Scotland could survive as a sovereign nation. For Union supporters, it was ancient history irrelevant to modern economics and politics. The vote failed, but the debate revealed how deeply Bannockburn remains embedded in Scottish consciousness. The military analysis of Bannockburn continues to evolve as historians discover new sources and apply modern understanding of medieval warfare. Recent scholarship emphasizes Bruce's professionalism and planning over the romantic narrative of heroic underdogs. Bruce was not lucky. He was competent. He understood logistics, terrain, morale, tactics, and strategy better than his opponent. He prepared the battlefield meticulously. He chose the moment to fight carefully. He commanded his troops skillfully during the battle. His victory was not a miracle or an accident, but the predictable result of superior leadership confronting incompetent opposition. The comparison between Edward I and Edward II illuminates why Bannockburn happened. Edward I would never have camped his army in a marsh with a limited room to maneuver. He would have scouted the terrain, secured his flanks, and forced Bruce to fight on ground favorable to English cavalry, or not fight at all. Edward I lost battles occasionally, but never through such basic tactical incompetence. His son inherited his father's army, but none of his military judgment. The result was inevitable. Once Edward II made the decision to camp in the low ground near the Bannockburn, Bruce simply exploited mistakes so egregious that they amounted to military malpractice. The role of morale in the battle cannot be quantified, but was certainly decisive. The Scottish army believed they were fighting for their homeland against foreign invaders. The English army was fighting for a king many of them despised to reconquer a territory that had been in rebellion for years. When the battle turned against them, Scottish soldiers had nowhere to retreat and every reason to fight desperately. English soldiers had no compelling reason to die for Edward II, and excellent reasons to flee once their formations broke. This asymmetry in motivation made the Scottish victory more complete and the English defeat more catastrophic. 700 years later, Bannockburn remains the defining moment of Scottish military history. It was not Scotland's only victory against England, nor even necessarily its most strategically important battle in the long run. But it was the moment when Scottish independence became irreversible, when Robert the Bruce transformed from outlaw to unquestioned king, and when English military supremacy in Britain ended permanently. The battle lasted perhaps 4 to 6 hours on a summer morning in 1314. Its consequences echo still. That is what makes Bannockburn more than just a battle. It was the moment when Scotland became Scotland, not through diplomatic negotiation or gradual cultural evolution, but through spearmen pushing forward into the teeth of an English army that discovered too late that invincibility is a myth maintained only until someone refuses to believe it. On the marshy ground near the Bannockburn, with an incompetent king watching his army disintegrate and fleeing for his life, that myth died. Scotland lived. And nothing was ever the same again